On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland and kicked off a 3-month-long conflict known as the Winter War. The Finnish army was impossibly outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought back bitterly. They were the plucky underdogs, and no one loves an underdog more than the Americans. Before the war was over, a now forgotten unit of Finnish Americans were battling the communists on Finland's frontier. This is their story. Finns have a long history of immigration to the United States. Between 1870 and 1930, opportunities for agricultural and mining work attracted large numbers of Finns, resulting in a great migration. Finnish communities were founded through the upper Midwest, with many families relocating from the old country to upper Michigan, upper Wisconsin, and Minnesota. This region even became known as the Finnhook. Ties to Finland remained strong in this region, and the Finnish language was commonly used alongside English. Children of the original immigrants were brought up to respect the autonomy of their faraway homeland, and many joined clubs and societies promoting Finnish culture. The Finnish-American community took a keen interest when Stalin, in an effort to secure a buffer state in Northern Europe, demanded Finland cede territory to the USSR. When the Finnish government refused, the Red Army invaded. The Soviet High Command had amassed 450,000 troops at the border and was confident that Finland would fall within weeks. Recent experience in Poland had led them to overestimate the Red Army's capability to deal with difficult terrain, and adequate preparations for Arctic warfare were not made. Stalin and his mate Kulik, one of the worst generals of all time, thought Finland would be a pushover. They couldn't have been more wrong. When the war began, so many Finns tried to join up that the army ran out of uniforms and equipment. Regular army units moved to the border to engage the Soviets, while militias formed in remote settlements and started a guerrilla campaign. Back in the US, the Finnish community felt this wave of patriotism too. From the upper Midwest, Finnish Americans began a media campaign to save Finland. They quickly found allies in the Republican Party who were happy to throw their political weight behind anything remotely anti-Soviet. One of these figures was Herbert Hoover, the 31st US president. He became the head of Finnish relief efforts, mobilizing support in the form of money and materials. But the major US contributions came from the Finnish-American communities themselves. Women's organizations raised large amounts of money with collection tins and donated nearly all they had. One elderly woman gave away her entire life savings to the relief effort, totaling $1,000. By January 1939, Hoover's Finnish Relief Fund had already raised $1 million to aid the Finns in their fight against communism. But America would send more than money. From December 1939, men began embarking on Finland-bound ships in New York. They were itching to fight. Landing in Oulu, men from Minnesota and Michigan arrived at the barracks reserved for international volunteers. They shared space with Brits, Italians, Hungarians, Danes, Balts, Swedes, and others. Large contingents, like the Swedes and Danes, were grouped into special units right from the start of the conflict. The other international volunteers were thrown into an infantry unit named Osasto Sisu. This is where the Midwesterners, many of whom had never been to Finland before, received weapons and training. However, it soon became clear that these men didn't need much instruction. Over a third of the Finnish-American volunteers were veterans of previous conflicts. Many had fought the Russians in the ill-fated 1918 war to reclaim Guerillas. The wild forests and lakes of eastern Finland was a battlefield they knew intimately, and it was here that they were deployed with devastating efficiency. Lieutenant Albert Pentilla, a Minnesotan and veteran of the Guerrilla War, led a guerrilla force comprised entirely of American volunteers in the backwoods north of Lake Lagoda. Pentilla's guerrillas wore all-white uniforms and used skis to maneuver through the frozen terrain. Their weaponry was non-standard too. Armed with a mix of captured Soviet weapons, Finnish army equipment, and civilian rifles, these men caused chaos behind Soviet lines. They observed enemy movements from concealed positions, carefully planning rapid and devastating strikes. They disrupted supply lines, took out commanders, and reported enemy troop movements back to HQ. Armed with information from guerrilla units like Pentillas, Finnish commanders could use the inhospitable terrain to box the Soviets in, inflicting terrible casualties on the invaders. But not every Finnish-American arrived in Oulu with the skills and experience of Pentilla's band. Most needed substantial military training to become an effective fighting force. However, the training officers had an issue with Finnish-American recruits they had never experienced before. The men from the Midwest kept deserting, but not to escape combat. They went AWOL so they could get to the front line. Possibly due to the media campaign back in the US, the Finnish-American volunteers had exceptionally high morale. Lauri Saarinen, the secretary of Minnesota's primary Finnish veterans group, declared, "Everyone in Finland, be he businessman or toiler, knows after 20 years it is better to die than to be a slave of Russia." Saarinen later informed the Finnish military attaché in Washington that there would be no shortage of men. Finnish commanders knew that high morale can turn the tide of a battle, so they removed the Finnish Americans from Osasto Sisu and gave them their own unit. At first, it was called the American Finnish Corps, but by 1940, it had a much cooler name, the Finnish-American Legion. By the time the bulk of the Legion's volunteers arrived in early 1940, the Finnish army was strapped for material. Uniforms were needed for regular Finnish infantry units, and there weren't any left for the international volunteers, so they made their own. The Finnish-American Legion contracted local seamstresses and kitted itself out in distinctive black uniforms. They also wore specially made buttons with their unit crest, crossed rifles on a blue background. On the front lines, however, the soldiers of the Finnish-American Legion wore white hats, capes, and trousers over their black uniforms to camouflage into the snowy environment. The can-do attitude that got them their distinctive uniforms couldn't solve their weapons shortage though. Until March 1940, the Finnish-American Legion was critically undersupplied with arms. But that didn't stop the men from scrounging what they could. Personal weapons brought from home were highly prized, and many legionnaires wielded civilian hunting rifles they'd acquired locally. Under its policy of strict neutrality, the US government refused to supply arms directly to Finland, but they did supply foodstuffs, which the Finns sold to the British, using the money to buy American weapons, albeit at a markup. These weapons began arriving in March 1940, by which time the Winter War was drawing to a close. On March 9th, 7 officers, 48 NCOs, and 251 other ranks of the Finnish-American Legion packed themselves onto trains at Tuira Station. Their trip to the front line took a few days, and they deployed on the 13th. At 0650, the 1st Company, comprising those most eager to fight, was ordered to rotate into the primary defensive line. But before they got there, word reached the officers that a peace treaty between Finland and the Soviet Union had been signed. The men were gutted, but resolutely occupied their line until ordered to retreat. The Finnish-American Legion was one of the last units to leave the front. Roughly 350 Finnish Americans volunteered to fight in the Winter War and deployed to Finland. The initial wave saw action in various units and Pentilla's guerrillas, while the bulk of the force readied themselves and waited for equipment. By March 1940, when the armistice was signed, another 1,000 volunteers had signed up in the US and were waiting to be shipped out. If the Finnish-American Legion had been formed as planned, receiving American weapons and training from the Guerrilla veterans, it would have been one of the strongest units fighting against the communists in the Winter War. History, however, took a different course. That was the little-known story of the Finnish-American Midwesterners who went to fight against the Soviets in the Winter War. But what do you think? Did you know the Finns were supported by volunteers from so many different nations? What impact do you think the Legion would have had on the war if they had been armed earlier? Do you think the age of volunteer legions is over? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.